Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm here with Govind Krishnan, who has written this wonderful book that I have been recommending to everyone that I meet. It's titled Vivekananda, the Philosopher of Freedom, with an interesting subtitle, How the Sangh Parivar's greatest icon is his arch nemesis. Now, I found this book to be wonderful not because of how it makes sense in the contemporary period, but also because it serves as an excellent introduction to the philosophy of Vivekananda as a whole. The contemporary parts, perhaps, are grabs the reader's attention certainly. They highlight the importance of Vivekananda's philosophy in our contemporary times, but you also have an entire section on Vivekananda's philosophy, which we'll talk about in detail. But first, just to be fair, I want to restate perhaps the cases that uh, many in the progressive wing have made against Vivekananda, one of whom you particularly mentioned, which is Professor Jyotirmay Sarma. And just so that their people who adhere to that viewpoint do not feel like we're not being strong enough in still manning their arguments, I'm going to restate it, and you can tell me what's wrong with that view.
Right.
So people like Professor Jyotirmay Sarma and Meera Nanda in her book, I think it's called Breaking the Spell of Dharma, Profits Facing Backwards. Yeah, it's called Profits Facing Backwards.
So I haven't read this one, by the way.
Okay, so I'll state a case for you.
Mm.
So she argues that Vivekananda essentially created a form of Hinduism, which is modern Hinduism, that is called Neo Hinduism, which serves as the ideological predecessor to Hindutva through its restatement of Hinduism as a religion with Brahmo influence. That is, it is a reconciliation of Hinduism with the crisis of modernity that it was facing. And see, the way she goes about this argument is through this. She states that what's exclusive about Vivekananda's Hinduism is the fact that he argues that the highest form of truth, that is Vedanta, is discovered by Hindus. So she cites Vivekananda's Lahore lecture, where Vivekananda states that he makes a differentiation between the
Disconnected.
science of the West versus the science of that his ancestor, that is the Hindus with their gigantic brains, create. And he says that the science of the Vedas, the science of the ancestors, are in fact the sublimest and higher sciences. And these are his exact words, where he says, if a Hindu is not spiritual, I do not call him a Hindu. Bearing this in mind, we shall be in a better position to understand why, for our national welfare, we must first seek out at the present day all the spiritual forces of the race, as was done in the days of yore and will be done in times to come. National union in India must be a gathering up of its scattered spiritual forces. A nation in India must be a union of those whose hearts beat to the same spiritual tune. So if you read something like this, it kind of makes sense that Vivekananda is trying to construct a nation based on certain spiritual truths. Can you tell me what's wrong with this argument?
Let's take the different legs of the argument as I have understood it. First is that Vivekananda is creating a neo-Hinduism, constructing a neo-Hinduism. The second is that it is an accommodation or a kind of coming to terms with modernization. Then he claims that the Vedanta, by which he actually means the Advaita Vedanta, this a form of non-dualism, right? Where the self of all creatures, nature and God is taken to be one entity. So Vivekananda claims that Hinduism discovered it. And then you have a quote like this, which sounds like mixing nationalism and Hinduism, right? And the claim is that all this is a kind of precursor to Hinduism. Firstly, take a look at Neo Hinduism. Uh, what exactly is uh, meant by Neo Hinduism? It seems to be that Vivekananda did not state exactly what has gone before him, but he modified it, right? He modified it in many salient aspects. Now, then the question here is, which major religious preacher, whether in Hinduism or in any other religion, did not do that? Every revered spiritual figure, I mean, whether it is Shankara, I mean, Shankara changed Hinduism far more than Vivekananda ever did. And in fact, the change was so tremendous that one can look at the history of Indian philosophy, Hindu philosophy from that point onward as an attempt to repudiate Shankara. That was the so he didn't merely bring around a reformulation; he revolutionized it. Or take Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine introduces a kind of Neoplatonism into Christianity. It is completely foreign to it up to that point, right? So why would anyone expect that Vivekananda's job is just to come to the West, where he mainly spoke, by the way. 70% of his speeches are in the West, only 30% in India. So why it's like you expect him to go and say, this is Hinduism up to this point. I'm telling you this, I'll go back. Why should he do that? He's a spiritual preacher working within a certain tradition. And like any speaker, any truly original speaker, he'll modify that tradition. Now, the question is, does the modification um, constitute a break, or does it have in its continuity with the earlier elements for it to be seen as continuous? And even this is a question that someone from within the religion should ask. For example, Martin Luther's Reformation was a complete break, right? It split Christianity into two. But would you say that? Well, then you could very well say Martin Luther King constructed a Christianity that was more in line with the emerging capitalist modes of production and the society that was coming up, which is not exactly Max Weber's argument, but if you were to exaggerate it in this manner. So I see little merit in this whole idea that he constructed a new Vedanta, that is a new Hinduism that's different from Hinduism. He expounded Hinduism as a original thinker within that tradition, and in doing so, just like people after him and before him, he did change it for the needs of the time. Now, about the nationalism aspect, it's important to understand that Vivekananda was speaking in an age when he was not the first person to speak about Indian nationalism. That you have a lot of people in Bengal. You have the Indian National Congress being formed in 1985. So Indian nationalism is starting to form. And there is a conscious effort to make a nation. And in that sense, he is, of course, talking about a Hinduism that would uh, make sense for Indians as a country, and for the Hindus as a country. And you could ask, why Hindus? Why is he even talking about Hinduism in the country together? But uh, whether it is a British, or whether it's someone like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was strident critic of Hinduism, they all focus on Hindu society because they see that Hindu society has kind of dominating influence over the entire politics. So they have to focus on it. And he is saying there that in the case of this, now that we are a country and we need to, earlier there were a lot of local Hinduism. There was no mass public sphere. And in Vivekananda's time, a public sphere is just starting to emerge. So that there has to be conversations about what Hinduism is. So it's a question that naturally poses itself. And to which he addresses and say, this is what I, so I'm saying he's not creating the template already exists. When he is speaking, people expect him, whether when he gives his speeches, which in India, which are massively attended, hundreds and often thousands of people, they expect, because remember, this is a sannyasi from Bengal who is coming to places in uh, not only North India, but in South India, and he's speaking in English. He's not addressing people in the vernacular. So, on what basis are they identifying with this person? The only common this is the emerging idea of an Indian nation. And so, naturally, the question of how do you map Hinduism in relationship to Hindus as one people, which was a conception that did not exist so much before the British. This right. So the socioeconomic political conditions create that, and naturally Vivekananda, as one of the early nationalists, has to speak about it. But the point here is that he is not equating Indian nationalism with Hinduism. That is what Hindutva is. To be a proud Indian, to be patriotic, means that you have to be culturally Hindu or pay it allegiance. But Vivekananda never makes that a claim at all. I mean, in many places he says that if you have to imagine a future India, and that is still years ahead, it should be an India that has its place for not only Muslims as and Christians as people, but for their traditions. Because and for he considered, I mean, I have written about this, and you have read it about Vivekananda's fascination for the Mughals, of all the uh, and even I think even more than Ashoka, he admired Akbar, and he considered the Mughals to be the greatest dynasty that India ever had. So he seems more. In fact, there is very interesting, and I think there's a lot of historical anachronism here, because you take up one text without looking and detach it from all the contemporary voice and text, and then what happens is that you are reading it in the light, the terms of reference change. You're reading it in light of what exists now in relationship to the text and discourse that exists now. Because if you look at someone like Subhash Chandra Bose, who, whatever else you can criticize him over the progressives, like his alignment uh, with Germany and Japan and all that, it was very, very sound on secularism. It was very, very clear on that. And he says that it is, I found it very interesting that it is Vivekananda and Ramakrishna's gospel of the equality of all religions. That is basically, I'm not quoting him exactly, but what's the effect that this is basically the framework on which we can base our freedom movement. That he thinks that he actually says that without the gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, we cannot have a freedom movement, because this country cannot be a country for all only Hindus or only Muslims. So even 20 years after Vivekananda, the discourse is such that people see him, perceive what he's doing as an attempt at bringing all religions together. So, and if you look at the historical influence, Vivekananda did not have any influence on the Sangh in his early days, none at all. At least as far as I know, no studies on it them show them to be inspired by what Vivekananda is doing. Vivekananda's influence seems to have been on the national movement, on people like Gandhi, Nehru, to some extent, Bose, all of whom were committed to secularism. So I don't. So this is, I think, this argument is again historical anachronism, and then you also okay one historical anachronism, second certain expectation that Vivekananda's job is to just represent Hinduism to his audience, without in some authentic form that he found it in. Third, attaching this to one of those slightly, you know, anomalous codes. Like if you take anything that when you say it's someone's thought, you're pointing at this is a spectrum. There you locate their views in the center, right? On both the extremes, you would have things that are not really representative of what they usually think. So it's common that Hindus are, what is that again? Uh, I don't call any Hindu a Hindu who is not spiritual. At the same time, he at another place he says that all of you are just atheists. So it's like it seems that he's contradicting himself. The point is that if you look at most of his speeches, he never urges the Hindus to be spiritual. I mean, of course, he urges everyone to be spiritual if they can, but there is no like he didn't lay down any particular do's and don'ts for the Hindus, except in very most general terms of principles. In what direction should your efforts be? Rather than you should do this or he didn't lay out any normative framework for Hindus to follow. And I mean, the entire thought is against the idea of a normative framework, not only for religion, but for almost every human endeavor. So I think, yeah, this is my, so I don't see how this criticism takes up. All the faults mentioned, I think the most striking one is historical anachronism, because I think serious scholars should be looking at what are his contemporaries saying about this person. And why is it that if he was anticipating Hindu nationalism, he was picked up by the secular part of the national movement, rather than, and why did it take till the 1970s for the RSS to even start speaking about Vivekananda as an icon? Why is it that he becomes Hindutva icon now, but not to his contemporaries or the generation after that, or even the generation after that, right? Is there? I mean, is that satisfactory, or you think I missed out on it or something? Oh, I'm sorry, I can't hear this. Sound is off.
So one of the reasons this criticism is made is because of this idea that the Vivekananda's Hinduism, the changes that he makes are reactionary changes. Because
Are what reaction?
reactionary changes because he believes in a time where things were near perfect. The Vedic golden age is something that he loosely seems to subscribe to. Would you agree with that claim?
Um, I would say no, or I would say yeah. It will be a qualified no, but no.
Hmm.
And the important point here is that the golden Vedic age, is something almost. Uh, I think a lot of the leaders of the Bengal Renaissance, including people like um, uh, sorry, the leaders of the Brahmo Samaj, like
Hmm.
uh,
Dayanand Saraswati,
no, Dayanand Saraswati was Arya Samaj. Well,
Raja
he was
Ram
a
Mohan Roy.
reactionary figure,
Hmm. Hmm.
but I was thinking of, I don't know why I can't recall his name suddenly. Keshav Chandra Sen.
Hmm. Hmm.
There's Keshav Chandra Sen, or in fact, mm, uh, Rabindranath Tagore make most of the figures of the the Bengal Renaissance who did not um, kind of um, react against Hinduism, but wanted to retain it, believed in this idea of an Indian Vedic golden age. I think, though I'm not completely sure, that in some qualified way, Ram Mohan Roy also subscribed to it.
Hmm.
And so did the British Orientalist scholars, William Johns and William Honiers, and all these Indologists who are doing all this uh, groundbreaking work on Indian scriptures and on Sanskrit and in other Indian languages. They also think that there was a time when India was a great civilization, the Vedic ages, and then all the superstitions crept in and it crumbled down. So even if Vivekananda subscribed to that, then he's only doing what the liberal contemporaries of his age, though liberal might be a bit of a misnomer, but you can say the more forward-minded intellectuals of his age did. But he did not do even that. While he did, for example, he should look at the Vedic age and about the Vedas, he says in one place that to a Western audience that the Vedas are a vast mass of accumulation, some of them crude, till you reach the end where only religion, that is the metaphysical, is taught. That is the Upanishads. So if you take the Vedas, so everyone talks about the Vedas. It's more like a symbol now than really a text of practice. Like, I mean, Hindus are probably more likely to look at a text like Bhagavad Gita rather than the
Mm.
Vedas. So the Vedas are have predominantly two portions. One is the Dharma Kanda, which is the earlier portions, which are ritualistic in nature. They also have some very beautiful literature and poetry. I mean, in verses, but a lot of it is taken up with various kinds of rituals. And then you have the gradual development of a metaphysical portion, which often either it delegitimizes the values of these rituals or says that they are not in any sense worthwhile, or directly dismisses them. I mean, there's a whole range there. Some try to accommodate them and change their nature. Look at the rituals as an allegory, and others are says, okay, this is not of any spiritual worth. Some finishes go so far as to say it is completely useless. So
Mm.
so when he's talking about the Vedas itself, he's basically using the words only to talk about the last section of the Vedas, that is the Upanishads. So even within the Vedic corpus, the structure of the Vedic corpus basically, and this is there in all religions to one extent or the other, right? The Old Testament is superseded by the New Testament in Christian exegesis. But here the break is particularly uh, sharp. So what Vivekananda says again is that it was an evolution, and you start with ritualistic ideas and move up to a higher idea of the Brahman as the only reality, which is the Advaita idea. And so he also feels so, he does consider that the Vedic age was perhaps the best, most glorious period of Hinduism. But he also recognizes that they were one given to ritualism. It was not as if
Mm.
when he talks about the ideals of the Upanishads, he realizes that it was not practiced uniformly. It was practiced mainly by ascetic rishis and their what do you call it? Their students, and a small elite group. While the most of the Aryans live, it was ritualistic, and in the later Vedic age, caste starts to become more and more predominant. So while he would say, I think his opinion would be that the Vedic age is probably the the most significant, most important period for Hinduism. But he would still say that it's not as if Hindu society was in any way perfect. It was, but he would also say, of course, when I say he would say, I am just, it's my interpretation, but I think he recognized that all ancient societies, because of the kind of challenges that they faced, right, could never be as egalitarian as modern societies.
Mm.
So he recognizes this limitation, and it's when he speaks even about the greatness of, and it's not only with the Vedic age, even if he talks about ancient Greece, which he admired a lot, he would still be speaking with that rider, that after all, we are talking about ancient civilization. I mean, for example, slavery was, so Vivekananda does not comment on this, though he was aware of it. He compares the condition of the Shudras in India to that of the Helots, the slaves of the Spartans. So he was very quite aware how unequal those ancient societies were. So that is my answer to what you were to say.
To look at this question objectively, which is to say whether the Vedas are the foundation of the Indian social structure, which is the Indian caste system, objectively it does not hold out. Considering the Vedas and the Upanishads, there are references to caste. There is the Purusa Sutta, which is arguably, and there's a very good argument that it was a later interpolation. So the Vedas, in and of themselves, are at best ambiguous about the social structure and ambiguous about the caste system in general. And the Upanishads, which is the Vedantas, are often quite and extremely critical of the caste system. The best example of that is the Vajrasuchi Upanishad, which inspired the Vajrasuchi of Asvaghosa and the Buddhist age, where it directly critiques the essence of the caste system. It asks who is the Brahmin, and it says that there is only one caste. Uh, and there's the difference between Sudras and Brahmins does not make sense except to deeds, good deeds. And that, I think, is a radical caste critique, and it is coming from the so called Brahmanic texts. And so it is not fair to say that someone who believes in the Vedic golden age necessarily believes in the social structure that it seems to promote.
Yeah, so the debate during Vivekananda's day was basically between Orthodox Hindus who said, so there used to be a lot of, I mean, unfortunately, I don't think there has been any real sociological studies of this, but the way and form in which Hinduism existed in the late 19th century, or even into the 1920s and 30s, is vastly different from now. And a lot of scriptures had were considered authoritative, which no one would have like even heard of. And not even the Manusmriti, but many other texts. A lot of them Dharma Shastras and Brihasutyas, basically texts dealing with social matters. And Vivekananda, what he tried to argue was, look, as far as the religious part is concerned, the spiritual, which is dealt with in Hinduism. If you look at the whole tradition, always keeps saying that the authority for everything is the Vedas. And if you look at the Vedas, it's clear that the Upanishads say this is what is spiritual knowledge. It is against caste. And the Vedas itself, you can at best say that there are some passages that are like glorifying Brahmins, but that's at best a reflection of social conditions as existed, rather than some kind of a prescription that it should be this way. But the Orthodox, so Vivekananda said that Hinduism, the religion, is not teaching anyone to be casteist or to believe in caste, but Hindu society has been doing that. And he was a stringent critique of what I think. If you look at anyone speaking from within the Hindu tradition, I cannot think of any figure who was as of that time was as sharp in his criticism of caste as Vivekananda was. And what his debate with the Orthodox is that the Orthodox claim that, look, uh, these may be the Dharma Shastras, as you say, they may just be texts of social legislation. But they get their authority from the Vedas. The Vedas support it. Vivekananda says, where do the Vedas support it? But these debates were not. It's not something you would find in his corpus. These are informal debates that he had with Hindus that he met in many places. So we have records of people referring to these conversations, but we don't have records of these conversations themselves. But yeah, that was the essence of the debate then. And I think what has happened is that over time, uh, these, I mean, it's again without sociological studies, it's very difficult to say. But even now, as caste exists in India, I wonder if the assumption so often made that its primary sources, some kind of scripture, is warranted because the way it seems to function seems to be as at the level of social structure. I mean, at least I do not know people. I mean, of course, I haven't looked at the whole spectrum of Hindu teachers, and was what you would find in the public realm could be very different from what goes on in, say, a village. But even if you take the conservative types, they don't seem to be actively promoting caste using scripture.
Mhm.
So I think there is a certain, and that is probably a change that has come about just because of how the religious discourse changed over 100 years of modernization and all that. But coming back to well, there's a question that you had asked which I did not answer, which is that in your first question, one part of it, but Vivekananda claims that Vedanta is the highest truth, and then the Hinduism discovered it. Wouldn't that make him a religious supremacist? Now, the first question I would pose to anyone taking this stance is, where is the example of the religious preacher who doesn't say that his religious tradition has something that the other traditions don't? If he doesn't feel that, why is he in that tradition? Like, and if you look at Vivekananda's contemporaries, again, historically, if you look at what people at the Congress of religions, the Parliament of Religions, were saying, of course, a lot of them were Christian, evangelists who believed in the exclusivity of the Christian message, and at the best they would grant. And a lot of them were sympathetic to Hinduism. Is insofar as Hinduism comes close to Christianity, it is true. But even those who took very pluralist positions, like I mentioned, the Zen uh, Japanese um, priest Shakuzoen, who was also there at the Parliament of Religions, but because he did not speak English, perhaps he did not get the kind of attention he deserved. But later he visited the US again. He wrote a book called Zen for Americans, and there he's trying to talk to them and talk about Zen. And one of the first things he has to say is, I cannot really talk about the soul because, you know, the assumptions that Christianity makes about it is not quite what Buddhism does. So he has to say that implicitly that on this I have to disagree and say what my religion is saying is true. So I cannot. So if you take any religious leader today, say uh, the most pluralist of them all, they would be perfectly willing to tolerate a different view, but they ultimately say there is something special, some part of the theology at least that, or else there's no need for a theological debate in the first place. That every religion like believes, or if you take any liberal Islamic scholar, they do feel there is something special about the Quranic revelation. They may not say it's exclusive, like many of the Sunni conservatives do, but even the more liberal theologians would claim a certain, I think, something special for the Quranic revelation, even if they are perfectly willing to admit that the other paths, other religions also take it from. But but I think this should be the lens to see Vivekananda in. But even there, Vivekananda's claim is interesting because one, by Vedanta, is not talking merely about the Advaita of the Upanishads. He's talking about what you can call non-dualism or monism. And he's saying that that's the ultimate in spiritual truth. And every religious tradition, every major religious tradition, has a monastic tradition within it. Sufism in Islam is perhaps the best known example of a monastic tradition within a very sharply dualistic, theological uh, tradition. Because, I mean, if you take Al-Halaj or Ibn Arabi, or we have hundreds of Sufis in that tradition who basically say that, talk about, and they have a conception of fana, of annihilation of the self in contemplation of God. There is no separation between God and the human being, which is what monism is. And you find the same in certain Christian mystics, in Kabbalah, in Hinduism. So I think there is a presumption here when this kind of criticism, apart from the historical anachronism, uh, that monism is an exclusively Hindu thing. It is not, which it is not. And Vivekananda was, I think, aware of this because he tried to read Christ saying, for when Christ says, I and the Father are one. Or you cannot reach the Father except through the Son, that he is talking monism. Or he looks at, I think, Sufi poetry in one instance, in a couple of instances, um, uh, Sufi monastic poetry. So he was aware that other religions had a monastic tradition. What is perhaps special about Hinduism, which he would say, is that it cultivated it in a very systematic and elaborate fashion.
His Interesting. Perhaps it's not fair, I think, to claim that Vivekananda should not have these views. It's like arguing that a libertarian philosopher should not say that libertarianism promotes the highest well being. If he
Right.
believes that a certain philosophy is a better philosophy for well-being than other philosophy, then there is no reason why that person should not say it. It does not mean that the person is specifically arguing that the other people are inferior to me.
So
So that is a crucial distinction that I think critics like Jyotirmay Sarma don't make.
also, it is the other interesting thing about and paradoxical thing is that Vivekananda actually constructs a scheme of universal religion in which you can actually say that all uh, all true spiritual experiences are authentic, that they all point the way on the same path. Now, and it is interesting to say that that kind of universalism is a very difficult matter as intellectually, because you have to reconcile innumerable contradictory claims about the nature of reality. So Vivekananda actually constructs an intellectual framework for a universal religion. And it is partly for this purpose that he is valorizing Advaita. Because putting Advaita or say monism at the apex of spiritual experiences allows him to say that all spiritual experiences can be part of this continuum. It would be a more difficult thing to do from, say, a dualistic standpoint, or even from the Buddhistic standpoint. I mean, by Buddhistic, there is, of course, a lot.
Madhyamika, I think, does it work?
But by Madhyamika, do you have Nagarjuna's in mind?
Yes.
So Madhyamika would, be against not only it would basically say that almost it is aimed at other schools. It's aimed at, for example, Hindus and their idea of Brahman, which is the idea of substance, right? Or just considered by the Buddhist society of substance. So basically, what Nagarjuna is arguing is that there is nothing called like an essence or a
Mm.
swabhava,
Gives the
no nature to a
example of
thing.
the chariot.
Yeah. I'm not very familiar with that particular example. Can you just explain it, the example?
So he argues that if you consider a chariot, the all part of it combines it to become a chariot. But if you take out the wheel, it does not become a half chariot or something like that. If you take out its parts, they will still remain, the parts. They will not be half of that part. So
Mhm.
it's very difficult to arrive at the essence because the
Wow.
essence exists with the combination.
Yes, and he has the theory of what is called uh, interdependent arising, where he says that everything arises only independent to something else. There's another argument that there is no uh, absolute truth, or not even any
Hmm.
absolute nature to anything. It's I read it as a
Slightly
uh,
postmodern in that sense.
yes, and quite to use the word in a non-pejorative way, quite nihilistic.
Hmm.
So again, are you saying that would you say that Nagarjuna was Buddha supremacist because he's saying not only, and he's saying not only Buddhism, he's saying that his arguments are also at the, I think, the Sarvatya, the Sarvish, basically there was a Buddhist school, I think the Sarvashtavada, which believed that dharma was an essence that existed in the universe. He's arguing against them also. So just because he takes his philosophical position, it makes sense to say that Nagarjuna was a religious supremacist, because no other religion has a corresponding something corresponding to his Madhyamika philosophy in them. So these are, I think, is strangely a kind of, you expect a sign kind of what you can call it, multi-religious, you know, uh, equality of all
Hmm.
religions, and you affirm it because you have no stake in it, but you never enter because religion is not a serious business for you. And you expect this as a normative value, and you find someone who says, okay, this is slightly better, and say, oh, he's a bigot. But people for whom religion actually matters are immediately they are in theological space where they are arguing for one position against the other. I mean, I don't know any serious religious thinker who did not take theological position. But I would say it is almost definitional impossibility to do that.
It also highlights the problem, I think, with relativism and moral relativism, because it's based on the assumption that moral relativism is somehow the value that everyone should have. And I do think that moral relativism is, it leads to a lot of destruction and uh, chaos, as we're witnessing. The best example of that would be what we're witnessing in the West concerning women's rights, where the definitional categories are completely broken down. And at the center of that is moral relativism.
Which particular aspect of humans are you talking
I'm
about?
talking about
Transgender?
that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, I don't know whether it has. I mean, I'm not saying you're wrong. I am
Mm,
not quite. I mean, they're with postmodernist kind of thinking. There's definitely moral relativism, even if they don't admit to it, or they don't themselves expose it
mm,
frontally. It is definitely there. Um, uh, but I have not been able to draw the links and say that the current crises that we are facing stem from that relativism. But I do believe that a lot of it does spring from what I think are the pernicious effect of postmodern and post-structural theory. I'm not saying that everything in it is bad. There are some genuine
mm,
interesting insights, but for me, there is far too much intellectual homework, and worse, a kind of uh, what basically are ad hominem arguments which privilege identity over argument
mm,
in many places, and it has in a very derivative and crude form, you know, percolated into the kind of thing that you are talking about, where you are breaking down categories of what is a woman, and it is so strange, but the kind of cultural intellectual power this has people who are otherwise quite normal saying things like a woman who is somebody who thinks he or she is a woman, and putting it into public policy, in school education, in medical system. And the question is, what about a man? Why are you talking only about a woman? Why is there not a question about who a man is? And I mean, though there has been some pushback recently, I think things are still sailing in that boat. And yeah, though I do not know, as in whether moral relativism is the issue, I would definitely agree that uh, what you consider as the offshoots of post-structuralism critical theory has had a large part, in my view. Or maybe in the way these theories are popularly exposed. Because I mean, I'm not an expert on any of these writers, but in the very way it has been popularly put to use by other discourses, I do think that one can point the finger at.
Yeah, so the reason I made that argument of moral relativism is because, well, I've written critiques of postmodernism, and I've looked at the works of Foucault and Derrida and Lyotard and Richard Rorty and all of these people who have
Mhm.
different political views. But the framework that they make, the central framework that they make, is such that all of those contradictory political views can be reconciled, because at the center of their argument is this moral relativism. So you will see attacks on science. You will see claiming that science claims the one identity, which is that indigenous science should be given as much importance to Western science, and those different categories per se, which at their center are essentially saying that the truth claims are based on the identity or the community or the social status of the group who is making that truth claim. That is at the root moral relativism.
Yeah, that is something that leads to a lot of problems, including moral relativism. I would concur with that.
So now I want to uh, take a bit of a detour and talk about your non-debate with Indra Gupta, because I think that is how I first came across this book, because it got a lot of traction on Twitter. So I have read Indra Gupta's books, not very impressed, but I've read them. So he are so he like his argument was essentially in response to Yogendra Yadav's review of your book. And he seems to have wanted to have a debate with Yogendra Yadav because he could very easily score points. Now, he organized a debate with you. Can you just tell me what happened? Because I think there's a central lesson here that I want to point.
Oh, what? See, my sense was that he really wanted to debate Yogendra Yadav because there was a lot of a lot of uh, mileage to be gained
Mm,
by you know uh, engage if you get to debate a major figure like Yogendra Yadav. That was my sense of it. And so what happened? When it came to debating me, he was less interested because after all, I'm completely unknown, and it doesn't bring him any, I think, any brownie points or more popularity, more social media, nothing. So he was definitely not as enthusiastic about debating me as he was about debating against the other. When Barkada's channel contacted me, one of the producers, he said he has agreed that Dosan Gupta has agreed to debate you. I would be interested. I thought for a minute, and I'm like, look, Barka is not one of those people
mm,
who does a shouting match kind of debate. So I said, I'm fine with the idea. I'm okay. And then what happened is I did keep messaging this producer from time to time asking what's happening, and he's like, Hindol and Gupta, he's not replying. And then he told Barka that I want a town hall kind of thing. And again, my suspicion is that if you have a town hall kind of thing, you can always count on the support of. I mean, it's very popular. With the mood of the nation being what it is.
mm.
And the fact that there is a lot of, if you take any random sample of people, you will find people who support kind of reactionary right wing politics. Perhaps he was counting on the element of crowd support. Um, that's my best guess because it is not as if he clearly said no. Just from what I understand from the producer, he just stopped responding. So he wasn't really interested in it. So I would say, yeah, I don't know. It seems to show a lack of real interest in debating the issue because, after all, Yogendra was expressing his views, but he was basing it mostly on the book that I had written. So, if he was really interested in if he thinks these arguments are wrong and he wants to put them to bed, then he should have been equally interested in debating me because I doubt he would have turned down a debate with Yogendra just because there was no town.
Yeah, I think he also tweeted, by the way, that why you want to do it online? You should do it on a town hall. It will be more fun. Something along that line. And I think that exposes a lot about the state of our conversation today, because it seems to me that the purpose of a conversation, the purpose of a debate, or a conversation like you and I are having, is to is to have an honest, good faith discussion where we can express our disagreement and see where you hold up and where I hold up, and maybe I'll learn something from you. So, purpose of a disagreement, the purpose of a debate is to arrive at the closest approximation of truth. Now,
Right.
what social media has done is it has made conversations such as this one into shouting matches. So the purpose of a debate is no longer to have an honest exchange of views. It is to reach out to your audience, basically. It is to have that adrenaline rush. It is to get more people on your side. It is to get clicks and views and all of that. And it's like someone who has written a book like Hindu Gupta has done, and he has a PhD. He's written multiple books. You would expect him to be interested in debates, but it seems like what a lot of the so-called right-wing intellectuals are interested in is scoring browning points and nodding along with people who building an echo chamber in essence.
Yeah, but then I would uh, wonder that if this is a problem exclusive to the right wing.
Hmm, hmm.
Haven't you ever noticed a pattern where you think that parts of the left and the right kind of mirror each other? Isn't there? I mean, I'm just asking you if
Hmm.
you. I mean, I feel that there are sections of by the left. I do not mean obviously. I mean, just as a spectrum, not that commitment to leftist economic this, but part of the left also don't lose many areas where you see a lack of nuance, a kind of argumentation that seems to be only meant to establish a certain position rather than to arrive at the mutual truth. Is it something that has ever occurred to you?
Yeah, in fact, I have often critiqued the so-called woke left, for lack of a better word. And there are a lot in terms in my university itself,
Mhm.
professors or students. And it's very hard to engage in a disagreement with them because disagreement to them means that you're somehow making a case that is morally abhorrent.
Exactly.
And that creates a divide of, it's basically purity and pollution. Like if you look at, they're disgusted by claims that disagree with their central claim, and they have the mantle of being morally superior.
Right. That's perfectly right. The left and that section of the academia and the spin-off, journalists, social media activists. It's like they assume a moral righteousness, and if you disagree with them, it's because you are either a knave or a fool, or because you have some investment in some diabolic um, ideology. And that's what the right wing also does, which is to say that if you disagree with me, it's because you are libtard, this, that. There is no merit of the argument. And this, I think, has been very damaging to the progressives and the left. This kind of, and this is the same. I mean, if you look at the arguments about, at least online, whatever I have seen about the trans activism versus who they called the TERFs, right? Uh, Trans exclusive radical feminists. A lot of them are actually just uh, uh, they're not even feminists. Many of them just school going women with
Hmm.
school going kids, and there is a certain anger. There's a great deal of anger, and which I see coming from the more woke position of supporting of saying trans rights are human rights, without making the differentiation that you're not claiming rights for yourself, you're also claiming for us certain privileges, certain access to what restricted spaces, etc. And the thing is, once you disagree with them, you usually can. You're either blocked or you're called a Nazi supporter or transphobic, and this has always been there. You disagree with, you're called, you can be called Islamophobic, you can be called, you know, supporting logocentric Western imperialism, well, depending on which discourse you are engaging with. So basically, it's what do you call it? Name and uh, you know, give a dog a name and uh, drown him, or whatever the saying was, right? So basically, this is an ad hominem form of argumentation, and it's very disturbing to see that uh, well, there's no surprise that the right uses it, because the right in India is not a conservative right, but a right that has strong fascist elements. And
Hmm.
fascists do not believe in the virtue of argumentation, they only believe in the virtue of power. So it's no surprise coming from them. Very disturbing to see a kind of parallel in what progressive and left circles.
But it's also because the right in India was the right wing intellectual in India was disenfranchised through the restrictions to free speech that someone like Nehru brought through the First Amendment. I interviewed Tripurdaman Singh. He has a very good book on it, 16 Stormy Days, where
Please try this, yeah.
he essentially argues that where he says that it was Nehru who destroyed the intellectual conservative movement that existed in India. So what came afterwards was in the form that it came afterwards was because the institutions were captured and given patronage by the left through institutions like ICHR. So the only conservative movement that existed would be outside of academia without the peer review process and with the crude language that continues to exist in today. So there was no academic space for the right wing, which is why the right wing exists in India in the crudest form that it does.
So I started on this book, a very interesting book, but unfortunately, because there's far too much to read, it's not a book that I completed. So I can't really speak to the particular arguments he makes. Um, though I am a bit skeptical that uh, Nehru's, I mean, the restrictions of freedom of speech that he brought would not really have prevented any kind of an academic discourse. It might have been used against something incendiary, maybe abused against something that is even, but that would be have to be on a public platform. Surely those wouldn't target purely academic this. So, and about the capture of the institutional left, that is true. But when did it start exactly? Because we don't have a real historiography on that, right? Because it's only the right who is saying, "Oh, the Marxist historians and they dominated this," but we don't have a critical voice looking at uh, the academic this. And I mean, this is not something that can be dealt with in a book on a wider topic like so many does. But I think it deserves a look of its own before we can say anything definite about where it started. But definitely. The academy has no place, not for the right wing, but no, I mean, in the sense the right wing is understood today, but there's no place for what is be considered conservative.
Mm,
And in as I think in a society, look, there are very few things one I could agree with the conservative thing around. I mean, I have in mind someone like say Roger Kimball, who wrote, I think, was the closing of the American mind. So,
mm.
or someone like Roger Scruton.
Yeah,
But what
Michelle
they
Oakeshaw.
what they seem to do is that often they spot problems that the liberal or a leftist liberal establishment or a leftist academia would have a blind spot towards. So one of the things that have happened is in terms of the transgender right debate is that a lot of the problems have been spotted by both the right wing and that section of the left wing, like Rowling and Kathleen Stock and
Yeah.
all the people. Um, so there is, I think, so in that sense, perhaps Indian academia has never given a real space to conservative opinion, uh, with which I think. it is natural for conservative opinion to exist in any society, and perhaps not having that is a problem, because there's a
Well,
very uh, huge gap, a line when conservatism, which can engage in debate, becomes kind of fascism, which believes only in power.
yeah, I mean, we don't have an Indian Roger Scruton, and that
Right.
is saying a lot. We don't have a figure who has made a coherent, philosophically rigorous argument of conservatives. And to do that, conservatives will also have to read what their opponents are saying. And Roger Scruton did that in his book. I think it was called Fools and Madmen, where he critiques Foucault and Derrida and
Right.
I think Chisek, where he reads their work and he critiques them specifically. He's not someone who is just doing ad hominem. That is not what we see from the Indian conservatives or the Indian uh, so-called Indic wing intellectuals, because that is how they refer to themselves. I have tried to reach out to a lot in the Indic wing to have a debate, a conversation where we can disagree,
What
and it
what is the
has
term? I'm sorry, I just didn't hear it.
Indic wing.
Indic wing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if people like Rajiv Malhotra are representative of the
Hmm.
Indic wing, then I really doubt if a real conversation is possible with them. But I'll tell you that. Uh, but one could say this, that there has been a deep neglect of Indian tradition, Indian thought within the
Hmm.
academia. Like, and I think that is, and because of that, I think when the right wing now uh, misrepresents Indian traditions, whether it's Hinduism or any other intellectual tradition or cultural tradition, the left does not have any, the liberal left does not have any access to it to deploy that tradition and say, look, you're misrepresenting it, or convey that tradition to. And this is not merely to do with Indian traditions, I would say even the national movement, because
Hmm.
a lot of historians have looked at, they're not exactly, a lot of historians have looked at the international movement as from the framework of, okay, this is a bourgeois movement, uh, and while that kind of critique has its place, when there's only kind of the dominant form of critique, they can't own the national movement. They can't use, say, a figure like Vallabhai Patel, who banned the RSS, who was the, you know, uh, he headed the, in the Constituent Assembly, he headed the advisory committee on minority rights and fundamental rights, things that are anathema to the right wing. But you find that the left and the liberals are unable to leverage a figure like Patel, because in their ecosystem, you know, that kind of work does not exist.
I think Pratap Bhanu Mehta wrote a piece about it, about how the left gives away intellectuals and Hinduism in particular. In this sense, the left and say the most extreme wing of the Hindu nationalist part agree because they both agree that Hinduism is this and it's oppressive. The only difference is that the right says it should be and the left says
It
that
shouldn't
was
be.
yeah, it shouldn't be. But their interpretation is essentially the same. And the problem with that is we haven't like consider, for instance, in the West you have had people looking at Christianity through a sociological and historical perspective, people like Bart Ehrman or uh, I interviewed a historian who looked at the historical revolutionary Jesus or Reza Aslan and all of these people who look who are not critics of Christianity, but they look at Christianity through a historical, nuanced perspective. you do not see that happening in the Indian case because the conversation has been so politicized that the academic part of it is almost minimized in our public discourse.
Yeah, you're right. Often the kind of uh, criticism against Hinduism, for example, it's whether it's patriarchy, whether it's caste, um, even when it's well-meaning, well-intended, often comes without any reference to the fact that you're dealing ultimately with a religion. And if you are look at world religions, the kind of roots they have played in society, then so it's almost as if to hear the way some people speak about it, it's almost as if Hinduism is a particularly iniquitous religion, as if there is something particularly wicked going on. That is not the case with other religions. But um, the thing is, all religions have been deeply embedded in the power structures of a pre-modern world, playing both positive and negative roles. So in the West, for example, there was a phase of reaction against Christianity, starting from the Enlightenment, and later became part of the academia, where they're trying to break free of the intellectual horizons that Christianity frames. So you're attacking Christianity, but at a later stage, there are also serious studies that looks at Christianity uh, in its context, and
Mm,
tries to arrive at a neutral assessment of, like, take it seriously, that this what did this faith represent for the people who believe in it, why they do the things that they did, why they believe the things that they did. And it is carried out on a very wide scale, very systematic, very thorough and rigorous work. And this is something that I do mention in my preface, that we don't have religious studies as a discipline in India. And this is really disastrous. And it's not only to do with Hinduism, but even, say, Christianity or Islam. Would a modern education department offer the resources to study these religions? Or even Buddhism. We
mm,
have some kind of a very stereotypical caricature of Buddhism. And if you look at the Buddhism is a vastly different creature from the Buddhism that is constructed in uh, the I would say the Western eyes of the Western scholarly lens, which looks at certain select texts, certain select classic texts, and speak of Buddhism without reference to various extraordinary proliferation of philosophical schools that say all different kind of things, the various kinds of Buddhism, and the vast difference between Buddhism in practice and Buddhism in theory. Um, and again, you will not be able to, I don't know if there is any, even for Buddhism, which is, I think, the one religion, perhaps because of its certain postmodern dissonances, as you said, is that the modern academia is kind of comfortable with. But even for Buddhism, I don't think that if you in any liberal humanities department uh, in the country, you would be able to really get a fair idea of Buddhism. I mean, you are in one of such one institute. What is
mm.
your view on it? Would you do this to provide you a space to learn intellectually about any religion, as a matter of fact? Not only Hinduism, but any of these religions.
Absolutely not in a detailed format, except say in the peripheral things, when it's related to, say, history or things like that, but not the philosophy of it, or the applying the historical method to these religions is not taught in our academia as much as it should be. It's not given importance at all. And also, part of the reason Buddhism has been so simplified is also the construction of Buddhism by Ambedkar, Navayana Buddhism, which is different from the historical Buddhism. And it's also because of the political reasons that it's been reduced to just that. A social revolutionary movement, which in any way it never was. It had aspects of critiquing a caste society, but was never completely advocating for the abolition of the caste system.
You're right. You're perfectly right. And this, so in a sense, Vivekananda, for example, often talks Buddha as a revolutionary against caste, and he was for the time he was. But then again,
Hmm.
you have to recognize that we look at the Buddhist practice and the scriptures. There's never a frontal attack on caste. In fact, there is actually a kind of obsession with Brahmanism, with often
Hmm.
going to show the Brahmin or Kshatriya lineage of the Buddha or many of the saints. So things are simpler. One is the influence of the Ambedkar project, but also if you look at the West, the way the West understood Buddhism, the Western academia understood Buddhism, uh, they have understood a very intellectualized form of Buddhism that is located, I think, in the Madhyamika tradition mostly.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think perhaps they have found certain resonance uh, to their postmodern sensibilities or intellectual values in Buddhism, that it is not proposing God or and you can have someone like Nagarjuna is um, deconstructing almost everything in a way, in a manner, it put very simplistically. So I think that is another reason. But yeah, and I find Buddhism fascinating because I I'm just mind boggled at the amount of philosophical
Hmm.
what the number of the sheer scope of the number of schools. People often talk about. I mean, there's always a conversation about how there's no Hinduism is so different in various parts that you really can't talk about Hinduism as a coherent category. And whether you accept the argument or not, the phenomenon is certainly there. But that is Hinduism in practice. Buddhism in practice has similarities wherever it is. But look at Buddhist philosophical schools, and then you find this entire mosaic of such different theology and philosophy. And and interestingly, I have never been able to. Well, there must be, but I have never been able to look at a book that is like that gives you a survey of this. You have particular detailed studies on one bit or another, but not sweeping general histories of Buddhist thought. I haven't found those, and I wonder if there's a real lacuna there.
Perhaps I read a book by Robert Wright called "Why Buddhism Is True,"
Mhm.
in which he makes a case for parts of Buddhist philosophy, reconciling them with the latest research in neuroscience and evolutionary psychology. It's a fascinating argument, and part of it is also done by someone like Sam Harris. Uh, but since we're talking about religion, give me a bit about how Vivekananda's Hinduism differs from the Hinduism or Hindutva of the RSS.
Uh,
Can you hear me now?
yeah, yeah. Go
Were you able to capture the last question?
No, no.
No. So
I
I
didn't
wa-
get it. Can you just give me a second? See?
so I wanted to ask you about how Vivekananda's Hinduism differs from the Sangh Parivar's Hinduism or Hindutva.
I mean, in a sense, I mean, in my book, I have already touched
Hmm.
on some salient aspects. Really, if you were to look at just an exhaustive this, I think one can. There is too many things, but uh, I identify four core areas.
Hmm.
One is um, Vivekananda's Hinduism is kind of against rituals is against orthodoxy, it is against authority. It's just while with the Sangh Parivar, their notion of Hinduism is not really very ritualistic. It's also it has a lot of you know pardon the expression, holy cows. Like all figures in the pantheon are to be respected, revered, all this. And Vivekananda has none of that. And for him, everything has to pass a test of reason, and there's no question of respecting something except insofar as you recognize it's true. So even when he
In fact,
talks
he
of,
refers to Vyasa as a madman.
yes, I mean, in one of his lectures, he catch to, so this is when, during a period when Vivekananda, after Ramakrishna Paramahamsa passes away, is forming his intellectual views. So when we see, when Vivekananda is 23, by when Ramakrishna passes away, and in 7 years, in 6 years, when we find him uh, talking to various people, he has developed this worldview. But there's a process in there, and one of the people he corresponded with then was a scholar called Parampradas Mitra. I think he was in Benares. Not sure about that, but he was a great scholar of Hinduism, and he corresponded him about his various doubts. And he says, in one place, Vyasa is saying, there's one scripture that you should never worship the trinity of Vasudeva and Shiva and Brahma. And in another place, Vyasa is saying that there's nothing greater than worshipping Vishnu. This is Vyasa, a madman. So, as you can see, uh, an artificial respect for figures of that cultural or mythic authority or religious authority simply did not belong to Vivekananda. And other most crucial difference is that Vivekananda differentiated between external religion and internal religion. And this is at the core of his theory of universal religion, that there is essential religious truth, and there are many, and there is the, so we talk it as a jewel in the casket. So the casket is not essential, it's a jewel that is essential. And the comparison is the jewel is the spiritual truth, which for him is something that you attain in superconscious, or what he called superconscious, super sensuous states of consciousness. Now, we can bracket the question of whether such states actually exist, or even if they exist, whether they correspond to reality. I mean, in the sense that that's a question that is not really something that we can deliberate on in the public sphere using reason. Right? So we can bracket that. The thing is, that is what Vivekananda thought of as spiritual truth. And what did he think of as the external aspect, the dispensable thing? So all the various forms in which they are expressed, whether they are mythology, whether they are rituals, whether they are, various festivals, celebrations, symbols, ringing of bells, whatever. So, but all this external paraphernalia, which Vivekananda considers completely non-essential, and he wants, and this is what people fight about and kill about. Precisely what Sangh Parivar has distilled as the essence of Hinduism. As far as Vivekananda is concerned, they have taken the husk of Hinduism and left its core apart. And the core of Hinduism, as Vivekananda said, is a recognition of the divinity in uh, all beings, that all beings are a manifestation of the divine principle, and that unity is behind all these expressions. So it is within this framework that he is able to accommodate every religion where there is a genuine spiritual component as another way, another path. So he says this, that it is not essential whether you believe whether you believe in the Hindu book or the Jewish book is not essential. So for him, if you are a true Hindu and you understand the logic of the religion, then your religious identity really cannot matter to you, because you cannot at one and the same breath claim that I am the transcendental spirit who is beyond all qualifications. And at the same time, I'm a Hindu sitting in a particular place or belonging to a particular caste, right? So that kind of universalism is so completely at odds with the kind of communitarian identity that the Hindutva project is crucial for the Hindutva project. So for Vivekananda, and the third thing is even books. Vivekananda, so when he talks about the authority of the Vedas, he's talking to fellow Hindus of where to look. What are the sources of our spiritual tradition? There is that hierarchy, and he said the Vedas are the more important. But it's also very clear that, and it is the same thing with Ramakrishna also, that books are only at best kind of wayposts. They point the way. Books cannot give you spiritual truth. So he says a sannyasi is beyond Vedas, he's beyond religion and prophets and all that. So, and for him, interestingly, Vivekananda kind of point of departure from earlier tradition, though the Gita to some extent definitely has this, is that in the modern age, he's that religion is not some religion by which he today we call spirituality. It's not something that can anymore be just considered the preserve and the calling of the ascetic. Every person in the world is entitled and needs spirituality. So the things that he says about the sannyasi is in a sense what he would say also about what is usually considered the householder or the non-renunciate, because he sees every person is on on a path to of spiritual evolution, and uh, even belief in God is completely unnecessary. He says that, in fact, he says some one says that the atheist is closer to God than the unthinking theist, because at least the atheist is trying to understand what is real, is making an effort. So in that, he has already moved closer to the truth than to the thieves who believe unthinkingly. Because the real thieves really believe what he or she professes to believe, then it will be very difficult for them to carry on a normal life, right? I mean, if you really believe that there is an infinite source of, truth or power, what do we call it? Then wouldn't you be seeking it with every fiber of your being? So it's so he's like, so in a sense, Vivekananda's religion and the way he exposes Hinduism is a challenge not merely to someone to the materialist or someone who denies that. It's equally a challenge to the religious, that okay, you say you agree with this. What have you done about it? Why do you believe in it? Then he asks, have you or even your ancestors seen God? Then why are you talking about God? Still you see God. Or when you see, it doesn't mean physically see, but experience it in a veridical way where then religion has not begun for you. So that is what is very iconoclastic about Vivekananda, and that there is uh, he forces whether people to confront this question, and it's it's not a comforting kind of philosophy. It's a philosophy that challenges.
But it's also true that Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, both of them, associated with their legends is also their emphasis on rituals, because Ramakrishna was, in fact, very ritualistic. The legends of Kali eating from his own hands, it's very famous. And Vivekananda, though he starts out influenced by the likes of
Hmm.
Brahmos and people like that, he also kinds of gives emphasis to certain aspects of rituals later on, and doesn't consider to be them to be completely useless. It performs them, in fact. So
Right.
it's not fair to say that he completely did away with rituals.
That is no. So I think I do. Though very briefly, I probably would have liked to expand more on this, but I do briefly touch upon in this in my book that Vivekananda wanted a reorganization of Hinduism, but it is not that all rituals would disappear. Many of them would, but uh, a lot of them would remain. But what would be different would be what you understand those rituals to be doing. What kind of meaning or what kind of purpose you endowed them with. So we have to draw. So what is a ritual, right? A ritual is a performative action where the belief of the agent is not a factor in it. You just perform it. So in that ritual, in that sense, and perhaps we should have a different word than ritual for uh, when when the sense is changed, we come to that. So I could say symbolic ritual, though it would sound like it sounds very odd. But uh, rituals had a meaning when they were understood as symbols. That is, you are doing some you're doing something. Um, no, rituals when they are considered in the usual form as performative, that is, you would think that if you say a mantra, say, or something else, the mass, whatever, you do it in a particular way, in a particular form, and in a particular order, a result would be produced. So if I say, it's like saying, if I say abracadabra, then you know water will turn to wine, or uh, into thumbs up or something like that. There is no rational causal connection between the action performed and the result obtained. But the belief is that if you do this action perfectly, perform it, the result would, you don't know how. This is, I would say, a kind of magical thing, right? That is the difference between magic and science. That science requires necessary as a completely sufficient causal, rational causal explanation. But what Vivekananda did not mind, sometimes he also did, was though was um, ritual as symbolic. Now you say bathe, you have say an idol of God, and you bathe it with milk or this, and you are imagining that you are doing all this. It's a form of what he calls sadhana, spiritual practice, because you can't imagine God who has no quality, who's beyond all qualities, but you have the intensity of emotion, which needs a focus. So you focus it, you think that for the moment this idol is God. And when you are bathing it, you imagine that you're actually bathing God Himself. But it's not that you don't know you're not. It's like when you watch, this is something I think Coleridge would have called the willing suspension of disbelief. When you're watching a movie, for instance, if you keep thinking these are fictional characters, you're not going to watch the movie. The moment you start a movie, you suspend your belief, your knowledge that these are fictional portrayals, and you consider them real to achieve a certain aesthetic effect. In the same way, is when you do these rituals, you know they are symbols. But the moment of doing this, you imagine them to be real to produce a certain psychological effect in the mind. And for Vivekananda, it is all of spirituality is a kind of modification of the mind to take it to the right state where you have knowledge. But even then, Vivekananda considered ritual practices as a preliminary stage, not something that is for the advanced practitioner, but is something necessary at the initial stages. So even Ramakrishna, after he had his, according to that particular story, the legend, after he has his vision of the goddess Kali, uh, he stopped worshipping at the temple for a long time. And he gave up daily worship for a very long. I don't know whether he ever continued it again, but because he felt that it was no longer necessary. And when he has the final Advaitic experience, I think he gives up all rituals altogether. So late when he not that he later he did worship at certain occasions, but earlier he used to worship them, do this as a matter of you know a daily duty. But he gives them up. And again, the other thing to be understood is that again, what does it mean to say that God is Kali or Krishna or Jesus? So what both Ramakrishna and Vivekananda say is that One way to say it is that God takes the form that you want to worship God. That's what Ramakrishna would say. Vivekananda would put it much more intellectually. He would say that you need an anthropomorphic kind of concept through which to apprehend something that is beyond conception. So it's like a form through which you are grasping truth. So
Archetypes.
yes, something like that. So is it true that there is God as Krishna? Yes, at a certain level it is true. A certain level is not true. But which is why mythology is not very important to Ramakrishna. Vivekananda, as he said, he questioned the historicity of all myths because what is not important is not whether the Pandavas lived or Rama actually lived. The important thing is that these uh, mythological literature creates archetypes of the divine, which you can through which we can approach the divine. So it is at the level of the story and signification that they matter. It being historically true is, first of all, he says there is no historical evidence for it, but even if it were, it's not really going to help you. Like, how would the fact that if Rama were really a king help you? It will help you if you realize God in the form of Rama. But that has nothing to do with whether, there was a person called Rama or not.
So I think he also makes a very interesting argument for God, which you elaborate in your book. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about his views on history and particularly Islam, because one of the things that uh, is argued by proponents of Indo-nationalism is that Vivekananda was, in fact, hated Islam and Christianity and missionaries and wanted, and at some level, he had every reason to, for instance, argue against missionaries who he thought were infringing upon the religion of India. But that is different from saying that he hated Islam and Christianity in particular. And the way this argument is made is because in a lot of places, he does say, for instance, in his lecture on Muhammad, he does say that Muhammad messed up and that the Prophet had visions which were hallucinatory and he could not differentiate between his hallucinatory experiences and real experiences because he did not have a guru. And in other places, he says that the
Yes, he
Quran
says that
has.
in one place, right? Where he talks about the the famous, the ascent to Mount Hira, right? That the first vision
Hmm,
that Muhammad
hmm.
has, where he's meets the angel Gabriel. So I remember one lecture where he talks about that could have been a hallucinatory experience. But did you have you come across more than one?
No, I came across only once, but I did come across other instances where he says that uh, that, and he says it at multiple points, that the invaders came in because they were inspired from the Quran, and in the Quran, the doctrine is that infidels should be killed. And I'm just going to quote him because this is his exact quote. He says, "There has not been a religion that has clung to this dualism more than that founded by the Prophet of Arabia, and there has not been a religion which has shed so much blood and been so cruel to other men. In the Quran, there is the doctrine that a man who does not believe these teachings should be killed. It is a mercy to kill him, and the surest way to get to heaven, where there are beautiful houris and all sorts of sense enjoyments, is by killing these unbelievers. Think of the bloodshed there has been in consequences of such beliefs." Now, if one reads statement like that, it seems pretty clear that this is the view of Islam that the Hindu nationalists subscribe to, and this is the interpretation of Vivekananda. So there seems to be a clear
So
similarity.
it's not merely the Hindu nationalists who subscribe to this. It is also uh, the Islamic extremists who subscribe. I mean, extremists, I mean you take the ISIS or just group like that, the jihadists, who also subscribe to similar ideology. There is also people, a lot of the new atheists, like Sam
Mm,
Harris
mm.
or Richard
Patience.
Dawkins, yeah, who have this reading of Islam. Now, the thing is, I think that again there is this, what I think is this carelessness in approaching Vivekananda. Um, Maybe there is that carelessness with a lot of other figures also. I do not know. But with Vivekananda, I think uh, the approach has been rather, he has not, when you deal with a serious thinker, and I think Vivekananda merits be taken as a serious thinker, then you have to look at the entirety of their work, how different parts correlate and relate to each other, before you say something about their view. Now, this is the thing is, whether it is the Hindu right or certain progressives who, as I said, agree with the Hindu right, except that they think it shouldn't be and they think it should, they pick on these particularly awful sounding quotations. Now, if you want to look at Vivekananda's view on Islam, we should take the entirety of what he says on Islam. And the first thing is that, and you should also look at his historical situation. Now, uh, he criticized and praised all religions because he was someone who took religion seriously. He had no the his and not only him, I think no one in his time would have thought of paying lip service to all religions and saying, "Oh, all religions are beautiful," or "All religions are good."
Mm,
For them, every religion was a project to get the truth, and you had to evaluate all religions for their merits and demerits. So Vivekananda continuously criticizes Hinduism. He criticizes Hinduism more than he criticizes any other religion. And that is because I think he's more invested in Hinduism. It matters to him more where Hinduism is going wrong than if another religion is going wrong. So it's not that he singles out Islam for criticism. He's criticizing every religion, including Hinduism, and also praising every religion for its positives. Then if you take the entirety of what he says about Islam, 90% of what he says is extremely positive. He says Islam is the most egalitarian religion in the world. He says that if any religion has come close to achieving the aim of equality among its believers, it's Islam and Islam alone. He says it several times. He defends the Prophet against, Western Christian allegations of, immorality of polygamy uh, and the rule in Islam that you can have five. And he says there that polygamy in a much worse form existed in Arabia, and what the Prophet did was to limit the number of wives a man can have. And he also says in one piece, Muhammad might have married so many times, but these are great souls. You can't judge what they do. Jesus might judge Muhammad, but who are you and I to judge him? So, if you look at the entirety of it, he is he praises Islam, but then about the blood part, see, you should also understand that Vivekananda's understanding of Islam came from the Western historiography of that period, and at that time, so it was commonly assumed that because of the nature of the Islamic conquest, right, uh, after the Prophet's death, Abu Bakr starts the Islamic expansion. The Sasanian and empire completely collapses. and they move into Iran and Iraq and Syria, and most of the Byzantine Empire also fall. Large parts fall to them, and this is the fastest expansion, territorial conquest the world has seen up to that point, and it will be superseded only later when the Mongolian invasions happened. And what happened is that all these places, Islam became the dominant religion. Now, Christianity, which has a very rather solid record of conquest and conversion by force. So, Christian historians, I mean, by Christian, I don't mean they were believing Christianity, but Western historians were used to that, assumed that the same must have happened in the case of Islam. That Islam, when it and Islamic conquests were obviously much more widespread and happened in a much quicker pace than the slow expansion of Christianity within Europe. And so they said, look, Islam conquered by the slowed, and they slaughtered, and they uh, forced people to convert to Islam. And it's only, I think, later scholarship. I'm not very sure about this, but I would assume that beginning in 20th century, where Western scholars are going to the original Arabic and Persian texts, that they realize that first, in the first place, conversion, the Arabs were not in fact keen to convert because they thought of Islam as particularly Arab religion. I mean, they might have converted in other parts of the country, but during their conquests, the authority, I mean, first the Abbasids and no, the Umayyads, and then
mm,
they don't. It's only more than a century later that they actively start converting, because at that point they thought of it as an ethnic, of Islam in rather ethnic terms, as a special revelation to the Arabs who up to that point did not have a revelation. And then later studies show that there were definitely forced conversions, as in most conquests you would expect, but for a large part, people converted to Islam because of religious reasons, because they found Islam perhaps in some sense simpler than Christianity, perhaps or more sophisticated than the forms of the Persian religion that existed, or perhaps of economic reason, the social reason, because of the fact that you became part of the Ummah and you could, to rise up in it. It was so it happened for these natural reasons, but this was not the common history that was taught and understood in Vivekananda. He said he had no reason to doubt it, as much as we have no reason to doubt the history we know today about the Greeks, for example, right? But for all we know, things can be very different, and later generation of scholars could unearth things that could change the picture completely. So this equation of cruelty of conquest and the verses in the Quran ultimately rose uh, in a context of warfare.
mm.
And to understand the Quran, you need to have one of the problems that people that has been talked about by many scholars in reference to the Quran is that unless you have the events, the context in which these words are uttered, you completely end up it's what you say, what Muhammad would say in a situation of battle to raise his to troops or improve their morale is completely different from what you would offer as a theological statement. So
Mm.
you need to understand the context of what is being said. And so this putting together of this rather military metaphors in uh, the Quran and conquest and forced conversion was, I think, the result of the historical knowledge of that day. And no, unlike now when we know better, but the Hindu nationalists would still prefer to believe that version.
But it's also the assumption that faced with, let's say, historical facts, Vivekananda would change his views on this topic, which we have no way of absolutely knowing, because he's not here. Also, because if you look at the uh, writings of Savarkar, he places a lot of emphasis on rationality. He places a lot of emphasis on evidence and doing away with scriptures and
Mm.
the uselessness of rituals. At the same time, he has a historical view, or he has a historical methodology that explicitly goes against that, because history is for him
Right.
a way of achieving political ends. So both can exist together, and there's no way of saying for us that Vivekananda would not have this view.
Well, I think first of all, the onus is just because Vivekananda went with the current historical assumptions to raise it doesn't I mean it doesn't raise any extra question of how he would have reacted to history. But I would say, look, when you look at Vivekananda, let's look at his approach to history. As I mentioned in my book, Vivekananda was an extraordinarily well-read man for his
Mm.
age, impressing a lot of scholars, first-rank scholars in the West, and he was pretty young also when he did that. But of all the areas of knowledge, I thought his strongest suit was history. I mean, in many areas, he seemed to know more than a professional historian would have, and his historical knowledge was vast. And again, he seemed to stick to critical history as it is emerging. In his views on what he does, make speculations and speculative connections, which is, I think, the right of anybody as long as there is some
Mm.
basis for it. But you do not see any place, as far as I know, where Vivekananda runs, except, of course, he challenges. At one point, he believes the Aryan race thing, and at another point, he challenges, then he changes his mind. You don't have a quite. But then again, at that point, the Aryan race theory was not very strongly supported. It was in the beginning, I think there was definitely a lot of ideological reasons where it was preferred. That the evidence started coming in much later. But other than this particular thing, I cannot think of any section where Vivekananda doesn't goes by anything other than critical history. Like for Bhagavad Gita, for instance, no, he actually, no, I mean the Mahabharata, like in a class given, teaching a class on the Gita for his disciples in the Belur Mutt. I think it was the Belur Mutt. He uh, starts out with, it should start with a historical question about historicity of the Gita and the various characters. Not because it will help us with understanding religion, spirituality, but because we need to have a sense of what is true and not true. So he had a keen historical consciousness. And then he goes on to argue why Arjuna and Krishna could not have been historical characters. And it's very interesting because he's not depending here on the work of any Western scholars. He's depending upon uh, Sanskrit sources, like, for example, Saptaha Brahmana, which has a list of people who did the Ashwamedha yaga. And Parish's name is mentioned, says Vivekananda, but there's no mention of, sorry, Janamaja's name is mentioned, no mention of Parishit or Arjuna. And so this is very interesting because at this point, Vivekananda could very well have taken the view that research in Indian archaeology is in infancy. And just like historical evidence for Troy emerged in the 19th century, right? After that point, they thought it was completely mythical. But now you find that there's some historical basis. Could have held that, maybe we'll find the Indian archaeology is hardly taken up. But he takes opposite stance. He's like, if we look at our own uh, 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 textual tradition and look at it from a historical point of view, we don't find anything to support the idea that these are anything but myths. So I think that is a very, very advanced position to take, which is why I don't see him countenancing historical, not accepting historical evidence, because Vivekananda was a keenly historical thinker.
Now, I think that is a correct interpretation, because he does question. There is no. It does not serve him ideologically, let's say, to question the existence of Rama or Krishna,
Yeah,
but he does do it, and he does not consider them to be integral to his philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, except in a symbolic
right.
form. And his argument for the existence of caste system, which is that it arises out of economic necessity, is again one that I think there's a good historical evidence for that. Plus, his argument that Krishna was in fact multiple person has been made by contemporary historian, which is that Krishna is a combination of of a of Vasudeva
Hmm.
and Gopala. Both of whom were different. Gopala
Was
would be
right,
the children, the child life of Krishna, which came later
right.
than the Krishna that we see in the Mahabharata, the earliest form of Vasudeva that we see in Greek inscriptions. So that he seems, and there are multiple points where you point out, how perceptive he was, how right he was about a lot of historical events, and this, I think, places him as a great intuitive thinker who, you know, got a lot of things right about the future.
Indeed, it's sometimes it is really surprising. For example, he even talks about the fact that the Buddhists in Afghanistan, though he doesn't in any way anticipate the destruction, he's saying that uh, the people in Afghanistan has lapsed into a kind of superstition, and they even consider this Buddhist stupas to be the work of jinns. You know, and that comment is very telling, and the person at that time would pay attention to this, know what is happening in Afghanistan, the history of that place, and ultimately what happened to the Buddhists, this the ham. So uh, that is, he is a very intuitive and perspective thinker. But talking about Christianity is very important, that we should emphasize that Vivekananda could say all this about Krishna, and in his letters appealed to Parthasarathi, go to a Krishna temple, because as he's, and these are not contradictory positions. He'll say, look, the legend of Krishna as the story is wonderful. That is the Krishna we want to know and we want to love. But how it historically formed, that's a different question. If you want to pray to Krishna, you take all the legends that enrich that character for you, that shows Krishna as having these divine characteristics, through which you can regard him or her as God. And in that sense, the Ras Leela, I mean, the different aspects of him are makes him a more wonderful character because he becomes more multifaceted. But at the level of history, it shows a disjoint assemblage that happened historically and points that there was no real historical character. In fact, Vivekananda considered it one of the greatest strengths of Hinduism that it was not based upon historical character, unlike say Buddhism or Christianity or Islam, because he says two things. One, future history could always cast doubt. If you're going to base the truth of your religion, you're going to lean on the support of a historic figure. Later history was cast doubt on that figure and what exactly he or she did. It just happened with Christianity in the kind of criticism, like historic revisionism that happened. Then, your religion becomes weakened. That's one thing. And second is like our religion is based on principles. We have rishis who saw these truths. We don't know most of them. We don't know their names, and we don't care because we can agree as to principles, but it's very difficult for us to, because we can dispute them, talk about them, uh, rationalize about them, and agree to disagree. But we can never agree as to personalities and personages. So he seems to have very acutely known that if you depend upon personages, the emotional can always be exploited. It can always lead to strife. And there's other interesting thing about Vivekananda as a religious thinker that I have not come across a religious thinker. No, I know that I have done a complete survey, but in my limited reading, who was so acutely aware of the danger of religion and who was always warning about how religion can lead to violence and social oppression and superstition. So at one side, he praises when he the spiritual truths as to an ultimate level. Other plus he's saying that religion does all these terrible things and it's a double-edged sword. We've always got to be careful.
One of the things that he gets very right. Yesterday I was talking with a friend about the lack of Indian feminists.
Mm.
And before reading your book, in fact, I read Ruth Harris's book on Vivekananda, Guru to the World, where a major focus of that book is Vivekananda's evolving relationship with women and how progressive his views are compared to other views. So my friend had apparently watched a movie, Kadambiri of Kankana, which has Kankana Sen Sarma, which is about Tagore's relationship with her. And it talks about, how much of an asshole Tagore was to the woman. So, and this is not something that you read, say, if you read, and Tagore is someone who is on balance much more
Far more
feminist than,
liberal, far more
yeah,
invested in
far,
women's education. So again, it's you have to look at that's what I say that you have to place people in their context. I mean, it was a time in society when people were opposed to women's education, and Tagore was so much of a reformist there, but he had a very, very paternalistic attitude toward women. He thought, I mean, he wanted to deify them as beautiful
hmm,
angels, but say, oh, but you shouldn't meddle too much in the activities of the intellect or the physical. This that's for the
hmm.
men. While Vivekananda,
He
when
says woman has to be ready to suffer.
Vivekananda, no, uh, even
Tagore.
Tagore said, yeah, but Vivekananda, though he also says that this women's greatest power is suffering. He also says this when women become liberated, they'll become as much oppressors as men
Hmm,
because the nature of human beings once they gain power to oppress. And he says this very clearly anything a man can do, a woman can do. And he even talks about warfare, where he said, even in
hmm,
warfare and ruling kingdoms, when women have been given the chance, they have proved themselves better than men. And he supported the vote for women in and that is a position you will not find a lot of women's right activists who were feminists taking. They opposed it. A lot of them did. And I mean, there were, and most men of that time did, with some notable exceptions, Mark Twain, for instance, and
hmm.
probably Bonner or liberal. But Vivekananda does this without exposure to any kind of the radical stream of European political thought. I mean, he did have some sporadic contact with Edward Carpenter, with the anarchist.
I think this is before John Stuart Mill writes The Subjugation of Women. So,
It's after that. It's after that.
okay.
And in fact, John Stuart Mill was, I think, a huge influence on Vivekananda's ideas of liberty.
Hmm,
And I think of all the concepts that you see in Vivekananda, the liberty or freedom is perhaps the cornerstone, and the idea through which he understood uh, almost everything else. And so there are parts where we can see Vivekananda again. You have to read him with the times. After advocating freedom for women, at times he would feel, okay, would it go too far? Will women in India lose to spirituality? Will they, become? And he expresses reservations on this. But the point is, if you look at Vivekananda's entire life, he's incapable of telling people, you shouldn't do this. If a person comes to him and says, I have the right to do this, uh, nothing that we have seen about everything we have seen about Vivekananda seems to indicate that he will not say no, no, no. You don't have the freedom to do this because you're a certain kind of person or you belong to a certain nation. You should forgo from that. And throughout his writings, that's why you don't find any prescriptions, even for the causes that he believed. He said, and to the women's rights, for instance, he says, hands off from women. Am I a woman that you ask me what women should do, whether they should,
hmm,
dress this way or that way, whether they should choose their partners freely? The women will decide.
hmm.
All the problems in the world about women has happened because men try to decide women's destinies. Our job is to take away the obstacles, give them education, give them the means, opportunities. Women themselves will settle the question, what is best for them, which I thought was a very fantastically insightful way to look at things. That, I'm not going to spend time saying, oh, women should be doing this or should be allowed to do this. Let the women decide. But you have no right to stop them from deciding their destinies.
That is quite progressive for his time. It's also, you quote various figures, and you describe, how reading them out of context, makes
Yeah.
them look like absolute racists. Even Abraham Lincoln, when he's arguing for the abolition of slavery, he says that I don't believe that blacks and whites are equal. And this
Right.
is obviously in response to the conversations that are happening
Happening there.
during that time. So he has to, throw a bone to the rest of the society in order to, not appear as too radical, because if you
Yeah, I
because you
mean,
don't have a place in mainstream
place it.
conversation.
Yeah, you're always negotiating with the people you're speaking to if you want to make a change, and there are strategic concessions you have to be. I mean, as you said, I mean, if you just take particular quotes, I mean, as I mentioned some in my book, Ambedkar in Annihilation of Caste talks about the question of Hindu unity and how Hindus are, you know, weakened by caste, and how the Muslim, he says that the Muslim is far braver because he feels that every Muslim is there for it. Well, the Hindu doesn't know that, and that he is weak. Now, this is a standard uh, textbook argument that the Sangh Parivar often uses, but you have to look at the context, because what annihilation of caste, he's talking to the Hindus and telling them that it is to your benefit to abolish caste. So he's trying to see it from their point of view. And says, I mean, it's absurd to think that obviously that Ambedkar would have any kind of Hindu nationalist views. In the same way, there are quotes where Marx is
Hmm.
from nothing, you from this uh, the Communist Manifesto. There is sentence where he is praising the grand efforts of the bourgeois and what they've achieved. Now take it out of place, and this is what his man said, and look at what like a reactionary he was. It would be ridiculous. And this sort of thing has happened a lot with Vivekananda. See, there's also the problem that Vivekananda had a certain predilection for saying exact opposite of what he said in one
Hmm.
place to another. That has unfortunately made things uh, worse. But yeah, the lack of first looking at the entirety of a person's thought, understanding their philosophy and the place various things have in it, and looking at the conversations he or she was part of, I think is a basic minimum intellectual responsibility that you have before you read any figure, whether it is Vivekananda or whether it is Abdul Kalam Azad or whoever it might be.
So I think you're absolutely right on that, and I want to uh, have this last section of the interview talking a bit about his philosophy as a whole. Uh, there's an interesting. You have a chapter in Advaita and democracy, and that reconciliation, if you ask someone like Pratap Bhanumehta, at the center of the debate surrounding modern Hinduism has been its ability or inability to reconcile with modernity. That's what someone like Savarkar was doing in his own way. That's what someone like Aurobindo was doing. Very good philosopher again. And it's also, just to add on to your last point, the reason Vivekananda says the opposite of what he says is because he's speaking to an audience. He's not arguing a case in written format. And when you're speaking to an audience, you're speaking to the sensibilities of that audience as well. And so you have to, you know, attune your message in a way that appeals to that particular audience. So it's useless to, just read his scripts devoid of context. Uh, so you talk about the reconciliation of modernity, democracy, and Hinduism, which Ambedkar has, and how it differs from Vivekananda. So could you elaborate on that?
So uh, Ambedkar, and this is very interesting that Ambedkar is engaging with Gandhi, who is a rather conservative Vaishnavite Hindu. He is also engaging with some reform-minded Hindus, like
He praises some of them. He praises Swami Shraddhanand, and he
yes, it was very
contrasts.
very unexpected. I don't know whether you have read this new biography that Ashok Gopal on
Apart, apart.
apart. I've just started it, and it shows the extraordinarily varied range of Ambedkar's views and how they evolve and change, and the fact that he was very adaptive to evolving situations, and that he also was very keenly aware of what is politically feasible. I mean, politics is the art of the
That's
possible.
also because he was a pragmatic.
He was a
This
pragmatist.
book,
Yeah,
which
he
is the Scott's The Evolution of Pragmatism, which argues that Ambedkar was one of the best philosophical pragmatist philosopher.
well thing. I mean, in philosophically, the movement called pragmatism, right, which
Hmm.
begins with Charles Sanders Peirce, then taken up
Ambedkar is
by
inspired from John Dewey.
John Dewey. Yeah, who
Hmm.
is so these are the three major figures. There's an interesting connection there because uh, Dewey took off from the work of William, uh, sorry, William James,
Hmm.
who is his predecessor in the pragmatist movement. And William James and Vivekananda were knew each other. Vivekananda influenced some of William James' views. So there is that interesting the connection there, coincidental. But anyways, that pragmatism is a bit different from the political pragmatism that we are talking about. And I think that Ambedkar was a pragmatist in both these ways. So, but coming to the thing is, there is this whole attempt to refashion Hinduism during the Bengal Renaissance as a rational, more humane religion than from what orthodoxy espoused, which runs from Ram Mohan Roy to Tagore. There is a tradition that for some reason Ambedkar is not engaging with.
Hmm.
So we don't know the historical circumstances. Had that tradition died out?
He
Had it?
redefines religion.
He redefines religion. But what I'm
Hmm.
saying is that there is no. So when Ambedkar is asking for in annihilation of caste, he is saying that you have to. He says you have to give up your belief in the infallibility of the Shastras, and and he says, I am told that your religion has resources
Hmm.
that you can tap. Like I think he has in mind probably the Upanishads.
Hmm.
This is the 1935 text annihilation of caste. But um, so there were Brahmo Samajas um, who took this very position that the Vedas are not infallible and who tried to refashion. And Upanishads were very important for Ram Mohan Roy and all the reforming intelligence of the Bengal Renaissance, which later, of course, became the Indian Renaissance. So that extremely liberal tradition is somehow eclipsed by the national movement, and I have a feeling that the national movement it ended up expanding the participation. After all, the Bengal Renaissance was in many senses an elitist movement, not elitist, elite movement. Right? It
Hmm.
never reached. But with the national movement, you have a larger number of participants coming in, and I think Gandhi obviously has to take along conservative Hindus also. Because this is a national movement. You cannot only have liberal reformist Hindus. This will be a as opposing colonial rule. And so I think the nature of the conversation about Hinduism changes, and perhaps that is the reason why Ambedkar does not come into contact or doesn't engage with this what we can call the Bengal Renaissance uh, formulation of Hinduism. So there are these resonances. So Ambedkar thinks of Hinduism as a retrogressive religion. That he thinks that Hinduism, in its uh, basically, is a religion that cannot allow for social
Equality.
equality. Social
Hmm.
equality, uh, and uh, of course, my reservation with that formulation is that I wonder if one could say this of any major religion that of any
He said
major
the
religious
same thing
tradition.
about Islam.
It is. in
Yeah.
Pakistan and
Yes, in
partition.
Pakistan or the partition of India.
Yes. So I would, so again, there's also the fact that Ambedkar moves away from the Western academia, right? In his 1920s and 30s, still in touch with what is happening in the academic world on a very uh, close basis. But I have a feeling that I'm speculating here, but I have a sense that from the 30s to the 50s, as he is operating mainly in the Indian milieu, and the Indian academia itself is, earlier it was what the British thought that was thought there, but that is also starting to change and post-independence just completely. So I have a feeling that the field of religious studies might have been evolving in a way that did not perhaps feed into Ambedkar's thinking, and that he might have taken a different view of, say, Islam. If some of you are aware of some of the studies that were coming out about the Islamic historical tradition by that time. But again, Ambedkar, however, says this, and it's very interesting, that after saying that Hindu religion is completely no space for fraternity
He says
or
it is
God,
a menace to liberty.
menace to liberty and fraternity. And then he asks, is it the case that the Hindus had no conception of liberty, equality, and he says it would be a mistake to think that, because in the Upanishads you have this philosophy. And here again, it's a very interesting incident that once happened with one of my friends who was a rather hot-headed Ambedkarite.
Mm.
So there was a debate on Facebook, and he was basically making this kind of argument which I was not very comfortable with, which is that someone was an upper caste. And you're basically making this argument because you're an upper caste person. I find that to be to undercut the very condition of possibility for any engagement, right? So just as an experiment in the dangers of doing this, I put this quote of Ambedkar about the Upanishads and how it is the surest foundation for democracy, and how the Westerners that paid more attention, they would have realized that India, like, it is not all the Greeks, but India also made an even greater contribution. And I put it, I didn't mention the sort of my words, and he just blew a gasket. And I think he was deeply embarrassed when I literally found out that some Baker's code. Now, the thing is, I find this interesting because it's exactly what Vivekananda also says about Advaita. But where we both differ is this. He seems to think, as he takes a position, then this is a lot of, it's a position a lot of people do take on Advaita, Shankara's Advaita, that it basically says that the world is an illusion. The world is an illusion, you have no ethical responsibilities, no
Mm.
ethical this. So, though that so there are people who claim that that is not, when there's over debates about interpreting Shankara, and there are those who say that, who interpret him differently, and Vivekananda was among those. By saying the world is an illusion, it did not mean the world did not exist, but that it was a misperception, a partial kind of grasping of a more complete truth. So Vivekananda also makes the same point. His interest, when he says that Advaita is the religion of future humanity, his reason he says that is that he finds in it an egalitarianism that surpasses all usual ethical philosophy, because the person you're talking to is God himself, and he is you basically. The the separation is an illusion. So that is the maximum ethical commitment you can ever have towards another human being. And Ambedkar make the same point that, after all, fraternity, liberty, and equality still doesn't close the gap. But this philosophy of what he calls Brahmaism, is a term he borrows from, I think, a British historian, I forget his name. He mentions him in that Riddles of Hinduism. And he says that this goes beyond that, because here then democracy is an obligation, not merely a choice if you believe this philosophy. But then he says the Hindus never knew this. No, Vivekananda would disagree, and he will not say the Hindus never knew this. He said the Hindus did knew this, but they never practiced it. So his position is not completely different from Ambedkar's, because one of the things he keeps repeating there is that we have this wonderful philosophy of the Vedanta, but we never practiced it. It was kept in, and he said, my goal is to bring it from out from the books and the forest, where the rishi is taught, and broadcast to the world and to the nation. But in practice, what they said is what he criticized as the principle of lokachara. This is worldly custom. Now, all this is fine in the scriptures, it's true, but for the sake of worldly custom, you should maintain caste and other religions. So there is interesting divergences between Ambedkar and Vivekananda. One on the question of the value of what you can say Upanishadist monism as a foundation for democracy and democratic living. Second, on the fact that the Hindus never practiced it. The third, on that Hindu society was deeply inegalitarian, and the Brahmins and Kshatriyas, and mainly the Brahmins, were responsible for it. Vivekananda is an extremely harsh critic of Brahmins and Brahmins. But again, he didn't want to alienate them completely. He wanted to carry them along as he wanted to carry everyone along. And there are times when he has good words for them. And that's again something people pick up and say, oh, he is supporting. But his attacks on Brahmins are sometimes almost vitriolic. So again, that allocation of responsibility to the upper caste, and interestingly, and the nature of the oppression, both agree on that. So basically, they agree on the nature of Hindu society. And they also agree on the fact that, so Vivekananda wanted the help of the upper caste for his project of creating a more egalitarian India. Now, Vivekananda was a patriot, but then you should understand his patriotism. What was his patriotism? His patriotism was love of the human beings whom he saw in India. And there, his concern was their material, intellectual, educational, and spiritual upliftment. So it was not about symbols or India becoming the greatest country in the world. His immediate concern is the well-being of all Indians. And then he says, as long as poverty exists, you can never rest contented. It is something that should trouble the conscience of all. And he calls upon the upper caste. Said you have been like living off the slave labor of the masses for thousands of years. You have been educated at their expense. And now the least you can do, repay for what your ancestors did and the privileges you have, is to uplift them. And now, interestingly, one could say from a position of rather radical politics that it is really ridiculous to expect the oppressor to emancipate the oppressed. But Ambedkar also, it is annihilation of caste when he says that I do not believe that Hindus would be able to reform caste. One of the reasons he gives is that he says, when it's a matter of political reform, that is independence movement, the Brahmins are all there. But when it comes to social reform, they're nowhere to be found. And then he says, you may say that this immaterial whether the Brahmins are supporting uh, the fight against caste or not. But he says, however, that's ignore the fact that the Brahmins mainly form the intelligentsia of this country. And that the intelligentsia is the people who have the intellectual power, who can guide society, who has the power to spread ideas and change things. So whether this is the correct view or not, something on which both Ambedkar and he agreed that this is what has the impulse for reforming caste, at least within Hinduism, has to come from the upper caste, because only they had the resources. But then they go in diametrically opposite direction. Vivekananda is saying, look, Hinduism as a religion is not casteist. The society is casteist. And Ambedkar is saying Hinduism is a casteist religion. Now, this is a very important debate. And I do not uh, think that to take a position like saying something is very convincing. But I think one thing that has been a source of great confusion is that when people say Ambedkar said Hinduism is casteist, and insofar as there is like the Hindu liberal, like for example, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who identifies as liberal and as Hindu, and who says, so who says, look, Hinduism is not that, caste is there, but it is, part of the socialism and all. The very when you say the very they're talking past each other, because
mm,
question is what is religion, and Ambedkar defines religion in a particular way as a system of moral principles by which a society is governed. It's in the philosophy of Hinduism, which is a chapter of a book that he was writing. And but he makes this ostensible definition, and from there it is easy to see, if you think that is religion, why Ambedkar would hold the positions that he held. But unless you, when you say Ambedkar's view, unless you're also clear that Ambedkar is talking about defining religion in this way, unless you say that, it the debate gets nowhere, because it's not what we usually we can mean many things about with religion. In fact, one of the things one has to do first when you talk about anything, say, is Christianity anti-Semitic, is Hinduism casteist, you have to first go around being clear about what is religion. In fact, that definition has a lot to do with what answer to that question you get. And I think if one has to have an intellectual clarity on the question of the relationship between Hinduism and caste and Ambedkar's views on it, one has to first understand that this is what Ambedkar means by religion. And then you will see that the person on the other side doesn't mean the same. And then you have to ask a question, you have to have clarity on what exactly is religion and how do we connect up caste in the case of Hinduism with it. And I think without that, I think any conversation on this topic is only going to end up, at dead ends.
For a pragmatic philosopher, it is quite interesting to see that Ambedkar's solution, which is the conversion of people to Navayana Buddhism, was actually not quite pragmatic. It's impossible to expect, all Indians to sort of give up Hinduism and to demolish Hinduism. That is a lot less pragmatic than arguing for reforms within Hinduism. Uh, which I think was the right way out, which is what Vivekananda believed in. And he was right to believe in it because Hinduism has, the Hindu texts do have the recipes that you need. And even Ambedkar at some level recognizes it
Yes.
for an anti-caste social structure.
So there has always been an anti-caste uh, strain within the Hindu tradition and even the Bhakti essays and all that, but it never reaches the momentum where it is able to, you know, uh, uh, to not forget win, to even displace the major notion. So, but what is interesting is that if you look at the purely theologic and religious, it is admirably free of caste. And strangely, we probably have to thank the orthodoxy of the Brahmins for this, because they were probably too scared to interpolate. Because they could have, right? I mean, you're
Mm,
talking about this being passed down centuries, and they have passed down ideas that are completely antithetical to their belief system. So it is perhaps the idea that this is something sacred and should be transmitted in that form that actually prevented, at least with the Vedas and the Vedanta, because in the Mahabharata and all, of course, the Puranas, there have been traditions from time to time adding on, because it doesn't have the
mm,
same sacred stature. There's something that you mentioned that about conversion. It's very interesting coming that you said you are an atheist, and I find that it's very perspective, especially coming from an atheist point of view, because I think while see if the thing is, if we are all to become Buddhists, that to get rid of caste, that would, I mean, putting apart the religious needs of people, uh, uh, would be a great solution. But the problem is, I think, that conversion has ultimately to be driven by religious conviction. And when you try to do it for social need, as you said, it probably will not go beyond a point. And not only with Hindus, upper caste Hindus, but even Dalits, they're invested in a certain kind of the Hinduism, and to get them out of it to Buddhism would mean that it has to be a religious need.
mm,
But but Anwesh trying is a social political movement, and historically, I don't think there has been a case of a religion being actually spreading on such a basis. And considering human nature and the kind of emotions that go behind religion and religious conversion, as you said, I don't think that it is a solution that is likely to.
Yeah. So
But
what
then
would you
again, one thing that I'm very clear with, for
mm,
Dalits to convert to Buddhism, to the extent that it uh, helps them to get out of caste uh, oppression, it is a very wise move.
well, it's also the case that Buddhism is not completely free of caste. There continues caste continues to exist within modern day Buddhism. Uh, what would you say?
Can you just
Uh,
elaborate on that? Because I have been looking at this topic, but not exhaustively. Uh, can you give some examples?
so one example would be that even the Buddhist, so let's say are followed in India. The texts that they follow,
Yeah,
most of the bhikkhus were Brahmins,
Brahmins. Yeah.
and there are texts, ancient texts in Buddhism, in the Tripitakas and things like that, where the caste is actually given a higher role. The fact that they're Brahmins is treated as something to be is treated as laudatory, and that strain seems to have been uh, continuing to this day in many instances. The misogyny, for instance, within the organizational structure has its roots in those particular texts.
True,
And
but Ambedkar was
yeah,
his Narayana
Ambedkar's
Buddhism was
Buddhism is different,
completely, yeah,
but
different.
he created a new Buddhism.
Buddha Buddhism, yes.
Created,
But again, the problem with that is you don't have a, a tradition to. I mean, you need to become a religious preacher if you do that, and I don't think Ambedkar was a religious preacher.
yeah, the only way to make that a movement like that successful is if an emperor from top down, like
Top
Constantine,
down.
says
But
everyone.
even then, you need a religious tradition. Even Christ, I mean, he was
Hmm,
operating within the Judaic tradition too.
hmm,
So, and the problem is Buddhism has completely disappeared from India, so that there is no
yeah,
background tradition that one can easily draw from. I think that would be one of the difficulties of that project.
that's right. So what would you say, given the political scenario today, or the Hindu nationalist regime in power, what would Vivekananda's reaction would be to the current Hindu nationalist movement, and what sort of society would he want for his vision of a future India?
Um, I think he would have been appalled by Hindu nationalism because it's a manipulation of all the principles that he believed in. Especially because, I mean, when Vivekananda goes to the Chicago convention and he speaks, he says, "I'm proud of Hinduism because it welcomed the refugees of those who are the Jews who are fleeing destruction of the temple. We welcome uh, the past Rastrians when they were fleeing persecution. And Islam and Christianity took roots in India far before it took roots in the West. So this is the toleration on which and he says, I'm proud to be a Hindu. And this is always quoted by Hindu nationalists. What was it that he was proud of? He was proud of the fact that Hinduism could bring other religions and treat them on, at least in some instances, whether Hinduism was historically that was important, but his ideal was that Hinduism, he's proud to be Hindu because Hinduism uh, wanted to peacefully coexist and actually could lend support to other religions without, thinking of them as a complete other. And about what kind of society, see, the thing with Vivekananda is that he never described or set down concretely what kind of, because he thought that was counterproductive. But it's very clear that he wanted India. So he wanted India to explore both her traditional, what he considers traditional sources of wisdom and spirituality, and also to embrace all the new egalitarian democratic ideas that are coming from the West and other parts of the world. So where exactly that take India, I mean, he desired a kind of union of both. He seemed to have decided, it's very difficult to say in precise terms to think like him, but he seemed to have desired a kind of um, fusion of spirituality and materialism by and where both has its planes of legitimacy. And and interestingly he found that Indians but the thing is, the project like that is this the project that can only be undertaken by someone who knows, or who actually, for whom the spiritual is meaningful, and who can actually claim like Vivekananda did, that I know there is a realm of being beyond what the senses show. I'm acquainted with it. So
mm,
it's not a project that, unfortunately, that we can take. I mean, I can take up on example, because
mm,
I am not a person who can claim that I'm a mystic. But what I think we can do is perhaps to prepare the intellectual grounds, for that kind of a thing by um, so Vivekananda's idea of Hinduism, he didn't think that the Hindus have to give up anything, but that the way they perceive what they're doing would change radically. So Hindus can perfectly say, yeah, Krishna is, or my it was is a mythical story, but they can equally completely take Krishna as their chosen deity and worship it in the most elaborate manner, and there is no contradiction between this. You can be so as so one talking about Indian society, he says that he asked one of his disciples in a letter from America, can we build can we build a Western type society in India with the Hindu religion? That you have all, you should be as liberal and broad-minded in social matters as the West, and be a Hindu to the backbone of this culture. I believe it is possible and it must be. So even in whether it is in religious realm or the social realm, this liberality of and broadness becomes the value as well as intensity, the passion to work uh, and this validation of creativity and originality and
mm.
all these things.
Now, that is a point that I absolutely agree with. And it's something that we need right now more than ever to create a reconciliation of reason with spirituality, which you showed in this book. Vivekananda does wonderfully. It was great fun talking with you. Did you enjoy the conversation?
Yeah, yeah, I did. It was great fun. I mean, I just thought it would be for an hour, but I just kept on talking and it's come. It was very, very interesting to hear your views. And in fact, I wanted to ask you a question that, as someone who is personally an atheist, how did Vivekananda's exposition of a rational religion, uh, how did it come across to you?
I felt that his idea of consciousness, because one thing that does away with is the idea of a personal God.
Mm,
Uh, when I say I'm an atheist, what I mean, first of all, is that I do not believe in a personal God. Second, he also does away with the idea of a creator, because that leads to infinite regress. Then who
infinite
created
regrets,
the
yes.
creator? So his idea sounds very similar to a point that someone like a panpsychist today would make, which is who will argue that consciousness exists in its minute forms, even in non-living beings, and that it's the permeation of consciousness which created this universe. Now, that is a vision of consciousness that materialists like Daniel Dennett will disagree with. They will argue that consciousness exists only in the brain. Uh, Physicalists would argue the same. But Vivekananda's reconciliation of reason and religion, in that sense, I think, is quite strong on a philosophical ground. Whether you agree or disagree, it is an argument that is to be taken seriously. Second, it by doing away with the idea of a personal God, he does away with the idea of convince instead apply to it. So the debate that one can only have is a debate that concerns perception, what he would call pratyaksa.
Yeah.
So it is that experimental line that religion needs to take. So I think that reconciliation is helpful, and it is the sort of religion that someone like me, that an atheist would approve, because it does not lead to dogmas, it does not lead to ritualism or stereotypes and
Normative.
prejudice.
Right.
So that is the reason. So I found his idea to be quite appealing, in fact.
That's uh, that's really wonderful to know, because that's one part of Vivekananda's thought that I thought is important, and
Mm.
which requires wider recognition, because it is something that uh, you- uh, someone uh, who sees the problems with religion can make say, okay, this is something that it's a vision that both the religiously inclined and for those who are inclined away with it, it's an idea that both can agree to look at more deeply and uh, you know could pursue as the the way religion should be.
It was an honor talking to you,
It's great
and
talking
I'll
to you.
put the links to where to follow and to the book, which I highly recommend. I have been recommending to everyone on Twitter as well. I
So,
will highly recommend people to again check out this wonderful book. Even if you disagree, have a great day.